This is actually one of my least sciencey talks. It's more like a Sunday school talk. So it's if you've been overwhelmed by some of the science I've been presenting, this one's a little bit less sciencey, a little more, tying it back to the Bible. But we'll talk about the science a little bit. We'll talk about the Ice Age. And down here in Medora, you didn't actually quite get the Ice Age. It was knocking at your door. It got to the northern unit up there. There's a few glacial erratics up there. And is the microphone working at all? Or I need to move it, adjust it. We're good? Good enough now? All right, just had to turn it up. All right, it's too loud. No, it's okay. The ice sheets actually got to the very tip of the northernmost unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. There's a few glacial erratics up there, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. But in my home state of Michigan, the whole state pretty much got covered. So most of my examples will come from there. And so you'll see some of the same things maybe if you drive north. But we're going to reveal the secrets of the Ice Age, as they say. And hopefully we'll start out with the Word of God once again. It's the same verse I talked about earlier. People in the last days, it says that God told Peter to write, there should come in the last days, walking up to their own lusts, basically scoffers, saying, where's the promise of his coming? For this they are willingly or ignorant. But the word of God, the world that then was, being overflowed with water perished. So they deny again the global flood. They deny the creation too, we talked about earlier, but they deny the global flood. So there's all that scoffing going on in our world today. You guys are people that most of you probably do believe in a global flood. You've seen the evidence earlier. You read your Bible, you believe your Bible, talks about a global flood, and the evidence supports it. But a lot of people scoff at the idea, particularly most of the conventional geology community. And of course, there's two world views all the time. The secular view, the conventional view is everything continues as it has, no beginning, no end. It's called the present is the key to the past. So that's uniformitarianism. It's a big long word, uniformitarianism. It's spelled the way it sounds, almost like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. But I can't spell that, but I can spell uniformitarianism. And it's just a fancy English word meaning everything's uniform. There's no beginning, no end, and that's what was put forth by a guy named Hutton back in the 1790s. And he's the one that put forth the idea of millions of years. Earth must be millions of years old because we only see sedimentation this much every so many years today. We only see erosion this much every so many years. So he looked at the slow processes today, deliberately forgot about the flood, and said that's all we see is slow processes. So he thought everything indicates long periods of time, even before they had ways to come up with those numbers. So that was important because Darwin couldn't have pushed forth his theories without deep time, the idea of deep time. And unfortunately, they need both those. If you take away the deep time, which the tissues that we're finding, the proteins we're finding in dinosaurs do, that takes away the theory of evolution as well. But God's Word tells us a different story. He wrote with his own hand in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, he said, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. So he reminds us in the Ten Commandments that God made everything in 6 days. Our Creator Jesus made it all in just 6 days. He could have said 6 long periods of time, but he didn't. He used the Hebrew word for day. But he could have used longer words if he meant longer time periods. So let's get started a little bit about the Ice Age. The secular or the evolutionary story really doesn't work. It's often called Milankovitch theory. They show this in every textbook. They try to show ideas about how we spin around the sun. We're a little bit further out once in a while. We rotate and wobble a little bit once in a while. I'll get to that in a minute. But really, this has been said in 1997, and it's still true today. Secular science has great difficulty explaining an ice age. So they argue that there's many ice ages, at least 5 big episodes throughout geologic time they argue for. Again, the idea of uniformitarianism. If an ice age happened recently, they figure there must have been ice ages in the past. So they go and dig up evidence trying to figure out ice ages in the past. The evidence is weak, though, for all earlier ice ages. There's a lot of things missing. They tell the stories, they draw the maps. It looks good. They're indoctrinating our children and our grandchildren with all these stories, but there's really only evidence for one ice age. That was the most recent one after the flood. And this is basically the evolutionary, the conventional story is Milankovitch cycles, dealing with the wobble of the Earth and how much solar radiation is coming in, eccentricity, the ecliptic, whether we're spinning out of our plane and that sort of thing. All these things are supposed to match up in certain cycles over thousands of years. If you notice, most of these say 26,000, 41,000, 100,000. If that was the case, we should have ice ages every couple million years. But even the evolutionists don't see evidence for that. So this system doesn't work. There should have been a lot more than they say. And so something's wrong, and it's their theory that's wrong. There's really only evidence, again, for one ice age. So let's look at the secret to this. How do we know there was an ice age? How do we know there was one ice age? What caused the ice age? And here's your Sunday school lesson for tomorrow, but we'll do it today. The biblical reason. Our Lord doesn't do anything without a reason. And so we'll see there's a reason behind the ice age. So let's look at how do we know there was an ice age. And I'm going to go back to my roots where I grew up in Michigan. Was there really an ice age? And this shows the extent of the ice in the northern hemisphere. This is the maximum extent in this map here behind you. You can kind of see a lot of Siberia and Greenland still covered by the ice age. That's a remnant of the ice age. And in the south, mostly Antarctica was covered, which it still is, and a little bit of South America, but there's more land in the north. You don't build up ice sheets on the ocean. The ocean only fills up about 6 feet of ice, and then it insulates, and you can't make any more ice. So the North Pole, there's really not much ice there. Santa Claus does not have a basement because he goes right through thousands of feet of water. And so you're just floating on sea ice at the North Pole. That's why it doesn't even show up on this map. What made the icebergs that sank the Titanic, in addition to arrogance, but what made the icebergs was Greenland, calving off icebergs from these continental ice sheets. So on land, you can build up thick ice sheets. In the ocean, you can't. So most of this was land at the time. Even Hudson Bay was land at the time. So we see these massive ice sheets. And we see in my home state of Michigan, most of the Great Lakes were carved by the glaciers. We had about a mile thick of ice. And north of you guys, there was a mile thick of ice or more. We're not really certain how much, but there's a lot of scouring going on, making these big lenses. And these lenses are following the softest rock laid down by the flood. So what's underneath Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan and Lake Huron was very soft rocks made of gypsum and salt deposited by the flood. So the glaciers are able to scour the gypsum and the salt much deeper. And that's why they make these semicircular shapes around Michigan, because the rocks go like this around Michigan, and they go out this way. So the same rock layer kind of goes around like this. And that's why you have these lakes that are sort of semicircular shape. It's not from an impact. Just because you see a semicircular shape doesn't mean it had an impact. This is just the way the rocks were deposited and scoured off as the water left the continent, left behind these exposed soft rocks. And so the glaciers are able to scour those more deeper. Lake Superior, notice I didn't mention, that's big fold. It's a little different. It's the deepest lake, holds the most water of all the lakes, and you can never swim in that lake because it's always so cold. Well, you can, but you come out with purple lips and pretty quick. But the other lakes do warm up right now. You can swim in the lakes. Even though the Texans don't believe it. All my Texans left, you notice, because we're talking about the ice age. It's too cold for them. So Joel left and Dave left. And what do you do? So here's the ice. This is sort of supposed to be a mile thick. It looks like it's 10,000 miles thick here in this diagram, but it's only a mile thick. And all these different lobes that came through. I grew up in this area right here, which was under the lakes for a long time during the ice age. Lots of clay deposits. Here's one of the lakes. As the ice started to melt back, it moved it back up here, and you allowed all these lakes to fill up with water, somewhat like Lake the Missoula. But this just naturally filled up. And here where I grew up was underwater. And then this is kind of going off this way. So this is only about 4,000 years ago or so, 3,800 years ago. But you had different ways the water got out at the time. Some of it went down to the Mississippi. Some went this way, they think, because the ice was blocking flow. And the land was also depressed because of the weight of the ice. So the land is actually pushed down, and the land is still rising today in many places because of the weight of the ice on the land. So that's how we can tell the ice was really thick, in addition to what it is. So then it drained off at one point because this broke free, theoretically, and then the water was able to zip off really fast. So we had our own little draining of the lakes in Michigan during the Ice Age. And in the process, they carved this big gorge called the Mackinac River Gorge. It goes down about 200 feet. And as this lake drained away, which became Lake Michigan to Lake Huron and out this way, and all these earlier lakes, they changed all the names of the lakes just to confuse me. And it's hard enough for the Texans to remember which lake is which. One of our displays has something on Lake Superior put in Lake Huron by mistake. I'm like, ugh, I should have caught that. But they don't know. It's too far north for them. And it drained up, but it was significant is that's why they built this bridge across that gorge. So underneath here, there's a 200-foot channel. Now it's flooded back up again. So this is a 4.5-mile bridge. I think it's the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere. So if you want to see a big, long suspension bridge, big feat of engineering, that's where you want to go and see that bridge. And it's, anybody been to the Mackinac Bridge a few times? See, you've seen it. You snuck over to Lake Superior or across the lakes that way to get up to Lake Superior in the Upper Peninsula. It's a pretty cool lake, pretty cool bridge. Before that, they had to take ferries. Anyway, then the water level came back up because of rebound. The land was rising because of the weight of the ice. See, the ice is gone now, so the land is now starting to rise. In some places, 600, 800, 1,000 feet or more. The ice was really thick up in Hudson Bay. So that was kind of the center of all the ice that spread out across the lakes. And so what happened is it filled up again. So here I am where I grew up. I'm still underwater. Thousands of years later, my family moved there. And it's all clay now because it's clay from the lake. It's very, very flat clay. And that's why the water in that area, we had to drill down through 50 feet of clay to hit some sand. And the water is very tasty. So that's my excuse. I grew up on these really old well water. Some of it was actually ice age water trapped down there, which we tested later for isotopes, showing that it's a much cooler climate that water came from. So it's really an unusual place, one of the few places in the country you can tap into some ice age water that's still trapped in the clays. But nonetheless, if you look up at Michigan's biggest tourist trap, Mackinac Island, up near the Mackinac Bridge, you can see these terraces. There's a terrace around the outside here, there's a terrace up here. And those terraces were from those two different lake levels I just showed earlier. You get the Lake Nipissing level, and you get the Algonquin level, the higher one. On the Lake Nipissing, you got Grand Hotel put on that lip. There's also a fort down there. All these things to help bring in tourists, essentially. And you can go to there's terraces you can see on the edge down by Mission Point Resort. You can see the terrace down in this area where it just drops off into a cliff, and all this was carved when the lakes were 50, 60 feet higher. So you can see these terraces just like you saw around Lake Missoula. But there's two basic ones here. And then you see the land rebounded. This is the Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes National Lake Shore. And you've got a 400-foot high slope down here that goes down. These were actually pushed up about half that distance by lake rebound, several hundred feet up, and the rest of it, the wind blew up at the top. But these are areas that are now 400 feet above the lake level because of the land rose part of that distance after the ice melted away. And all the lakes in that area all kind of flow and follow the direction of glacial movement. You can see all these features in here we'll talk about in a minute. But you see even the lakes along here all kind of follow the same direction as Lake Michigan does over here. This is Torch Lake, one of the cleanest lakes in the country in terms of clarity of water because it's all sandy bottomed. But if you drive around Ellsworth, the town of Ellsworth there, not too far from Traverse City, you'll see these drumlins. And you can see these drumlin fields go up and down. They're about a mile long maybe and about 300 feet high. And these are part of the glaciers, patterns that form. I thought I had another one in there, better one. Maybe I used the wrong one. I had a newer picture of a better one, but that's beside the point. It's okay. Those are older ones. Here I am again standing by a glacial erratic. These are pieces of Canada. They got moved down in the ice. And you have the same issue up here in your Theodore Roosevelt National Park in your north unit. You got a few rocks that were dropped by the ice, that were carried by the ice, and the ice melted and the rocks just drop. So they're out of place rocks called erratics. And then you have grooves and striations in some of the limestones in Michigan where there's rocks at the bottom, just scratching along as the ice moved and flowed. And as it did it, of course, it scoured into the rocks and left behind scratches. Just in Minnesota, we went over near Duluth, north of Duluth, a couple years ago. Well, actually, a year and a half ago, Dr. G, we see these striations on the bedrock surface. Again, those show us the direction the glaciers move. So you got drumlins that show the direction, you got lakes that show the direction, scratches, striations. You can see all this evidence that the glaciers really were there. They really were moving from the thickest ice to the thinnest ice. So they flowed from thickest to thinnest. Thickest ice was in Hudson Bay in North America. And you also have these big Michigan ski resorts that are found in all of these moraines, they're called. So all these little wormy things are all these moraines where the glaciers moved up there temporarily, maybe for 20, 30 years, dumped a bunch of material, and then move back or move forward or whatever they did. They might have melted back, but they left behind these big piles of debris, and these become Michigan's massive mountains, which are a few hundred feet high. These are the ski resorts in Michigan, so you can see they have the lifts and stuff coming along here near Boyne Mountain. This one's pretty nice in the summertime. I forget how green it is till I go back. But also, Michigan's state fossil, the mastodon, which is a little smaller than a woolly mammoth. There's a lot of mastodons found in the lower peninsula, south of where the ice was. Almost every county has found at least a mastodon or a mammoth. I think they found a mammoth recently there. But this is our state fossil because there's so many of them. And so what caused the ice age? Let's look at that. So we know there was an ice age. We can see the evidence, maybe not here in Medora, but just north of Medora. And then as you go east of here and then northeast of here, you can see more and more evidence of these moraines. And it's almost like God made a ready-made soil, ground up the rocks with the ice and left behind all this debris behind, which makes really good soil for a lot of North Dakota further, at least east of here. So let's look at what caused it. If it's not Milankovitch theory, what could have caused an ice age? What could have caused one ice age? Well, there's two real requirements we need. One is you need a lot of snow that builds up for many consecutive years. Because if you build up a lot of snow, that snow eventually over more snow, you get a thick enough pile of snow, it turns into ice. So continental ice sheets come from snow that builds up. It doesn't melt from year to year to year. And so very quickly, if it's snowing a lot, you can build up a lot of snow. A lot of that snow will eventually become a lot of ice. And so that's how continental glaciers form. Second thing you need between cooler summers and heavy snowfall, you need it cool enough that it doesn't melt. So even though it's cold here in North Dakota every year, it does melt off. The snow does melt. The climate's not as cold as it was during the ice age. So you need a cool climate, and you need a lot of snowfall or a lot of rainfall that in the north became snow. So how do we do that? Well, a lot of volcanoes, especially the catastrophic eruptions like at Mount St. Helens, these ones that are caused by subduction zones. So we talked about plate tectonics, rapid catastrophic plate tectonics last night. Some of you were asleep maybe. Maybe you weren't here. But if you have a lot of subduction zone volcanoes, you get these explosive magmas. The magmas are a different chemistry than you get at Hawaii, for example. Hawaii doesn't explode catastrophically like Mount St. Helens did, or Mount Pinatubo did, or the islands of the Caribbean. Those islands are all formed by explosive volcanoes caused by plates of the earth subducting underneath, and up comes this really, kind of a volatile chemistry, and it makes very explosive magmas. So you need that type of thing. So part of the reason why I think God used catastrophic plate tectonics to bring on the flood in addition to pushing the water up was he had a plan for later that we need a cooler climate. And these volcanoes just happen to form enough aerosols that you can block out just enough sunlight to really cool the earth. And so you have lots of volcanoes erupting all over the earth, you're going to get lots of solar cooling because the sun doesn't get into the lower atmosphere. So it's the opposite of the big scare today of global warming. This was global cooling. If you have enough volcanoes erupting, there will be no global warming. It'll actually get cooler. So what happened? Mount St. Helens erupted. You guys, some of you might remember Mount St. Helens. Anybody? Some of you maybe weren't born until after that, but you might have read about it. It happened in our own backyard, and it really changed geology. Most of the conventional geologists now have to admit, not everything's uniform all the time. There's major catastrophic events, but they still won't admit there's a flood. But they do admit now there's catastrophes. Well, Mount St. Helens didn't do much. There's a big explosion, but it didn't cool the earth. But when Tambora erupted in Indonesia, it did. 1815, you can see up here. It was known as the year across Europe as the year without a summer. There was so much ash in the air from Indonesia that it cooled the climate across the whole world, including Europe. So it's known as the year without a summer. Krakatoa erupted in 1883. The whole island blew up, created tsunamis, but threw so much ash and aerosols into the atmosphere. And those aerosols will stay up there for several years from just one volcano. And that cooled the earth, dropped it at 1.2 degrees Celsius. Pinatubo erupted in 1991. Anybody remember that one in the Philippines? Maybe you're in the Air Force Base there, Clark Air Force Base. They had to evacuate. Big explosion. That cooled the earth as well by only about a half degree Celsius, a couple degrees Fahrenheit. But it made a big deal up here. Those of you living in North Dakota probably had a really cold year in 92. Because when I was in Michigan, I got laid off from the oil company. I went back to Michigan for my PhD. It got down to 35 below in the lower peninsula, which is really unusual. Only that year, 1992, because of Mount Pinatubo. So the further north you are, the more extreme these aerosols are. So if you're living in Texas during the Ice Age, it was cool, but it wasn't that cold. So you have mastodons, mammoths living down in Texas, but you didn't have ice sheets. Ice sheets only formed to the north. So how do we get a lot of volcanoes erupting all the time to keep replenishing the aerosols? If you just have one every 10 years, it's not going to do it. Well, the answer goes back to the flood. This was the rock types from this is maybe 5 continents worth of data. I didn't update it to the 6th continent yet. But here's our mega sequences we talked about. Notice at the bottom shows the red. The red is the volcanic rocks. Don't worry about the other ones. There's shales and limestones and sand. But you see the red increases as you go this way. So right in here, where you guys are, the rocks out here are right at the boundary between these two. And you see there's lots of volcanic activity. There's a lot of other rocks as well. There's a lot of volcanic activity. And you guys were close to the west coast, so you're getting all this ash coming all the way from the west coast, building up in your rocks right around Medora and as far east as Texas. There's not a lot of ash in the rocks in Michigan. It didn't quite go that far. But there's ash all on the Rockies. People have a lot of problems with their foundations because a lot of that ash turns into this mineral called bentonite. And bentonite swells and expands when it gets wet and shrinks when it dries out, and it causes foundations to crack. It's the #1 environmental hazard in the United States in terms of dollars that cost every year for a lot of foundation problems. But this is what happened in the flood, is you basically have most of the activity occurs at the end. And that was by design. That's where all those subduction zones are pushing material in, and the magma finally worked its way up, but most of it peaked at the end of the flood. There was a plan behind that. Here's some of the volcanoes that erupted as the floodwaters were receding. This is Mount St. Helens, this little poof. But look at these other ones that happened during the receding phase of the flood. From Texas all the way up over here. So if Yellowstone erupts again, they're saying that we're all going to die. Because it does spread ash all around here, I don't think we'll all die. I don't think it'll erupt again. Yellowstone was a flood event. The big eruptions at Yellowstone was a flood event during the receding phase, same time these rocks are being deposited out here. So I don't think this will ever happen again. These are all mostly flood events. This is a post-flood event, that little red thing. So I've got these, again, keep in mind Mount St. Helens was small compared to Yellowstone. This is an actual picture taken by NOAA of the supervolcanic eruption at Yellowstone. That's not quite true either. I just seen if you're paying attention, that's not quite true. They only had black and white film back then, remember? So they didn't have this. But he wasn't anywhere near this. He was over somewhere near, the mountains of Ararat by this point. As the water's going down, he already grounded on day 150. This is after day 150. So you have thousands of feet of volcanic debris around Yellowstone and Cody, Wyoming, all around there. Those are all putting aerosols into the atmosphere, cooling the earth. So we have this end of the flood. You have a lot of volcanic activity. It was peaking right at the end of the flood. As you saw, the rocks really do show this. And over time, they drop down to where we are today, where there's just an occasional eruption, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 20 years, a big eruption. But at the end of the flood, they were peaking. Every volcano was erupting. The Cascades were all erupting. The Aleutians were all erupting. All around the Pacific, all those islands were erupting, building those islands that we have today. The Caribbean, they are erupting. All over the world, all these volcanoes are erupting, and today there's just one or two. But that's what the rocks really do show, a peak in volcanic activity towards the end of the flood. So these spikes, of course, in the volcanic activity replenish the aerosols. So for a few hundred years after the flood, you're going to have lots of cold climate, especially in the north, enough time for the snow to build up into ice. But where does all the ice and snow come from? Where does all the moisture come from? So you have lots of cooler summers, but where does the snow come from? It comes from the oceans. Even today, most of our moisture comes from the oceans. Now, I grew up in Michigan. People think, the Great Lakes produce evaporation. No, even in Michigan, most of the moisture in Michigan is from the oceans. Very little comes from the lakes. How do you get the oceans hot? If you heat water up, it's going to cause more evaporation. So how do you heat the oceans? We talked about this last night too. You make a whole new seafloor out of lava, making those new plates and moving the making new ocean crust, that's all lava. 60 miles of lava making those plates. So all that heat gets transferred to the oceans. And the oceans got very, very hot. And water holds heat better than the land does. So in Michigan, we have milder winters than Wisconsin because we have the Great Lakes to kind of warm the air temperatures. Water takes longer to heat up and longer to cool down than rocks do. And so you make all this new lava underneath the oceans. The entire ocean floor was renewed, made new during the flood year. You get a real hot water. Mike Ord, I think, has estimated temperatures as high as 20 degrees Celsius. Which is like 70 degrees or so to you and me. So the water all over the world might have been as much as 70 degrees or even warmer. Well, warmer water is going to cause a lot more evaporation, and you have a lot more rain. You're also going to have a lot more snow where it's colder. So in the north, it came down as snow. In Texas, it came down as rain. Maybe a little bit of snow. In the Middle East, where Job was living, there was a lot of snow even, but mostly rain. The ice sheets, again, were north of the Middle East, where most of the patriarchs were living. So even in the time of Abraham, time of Job, the ice age was raging to the north, but it was just wet where they were at, cooler and wet. But Job does talk a lot about snow and ice in the book of Job. We'll get to that a little later. I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's kind of the glacial maximum according to Mike Ord's estimates, maybe 500 years after the flood. So the flood ends 4,400 years ago, maybe about 3,900 years ago. You're at the ice age maximum, where the maximum amount of ice is built up in 500 years. So that hot water is not going to wait. You're going to start getting rain right away. You're probably getting snow even before the flood ended in the north. As the water is draining off, it's probably coming down as snow because that water is just pumping it out. And the volcanoes are cooling the atmosphere by pumping all these aerosols up all over the world. So you're already getting snow coming down and lots of rain, even as the animals and Noah were exiting the ark. But that snow in the north kept building up year after year after year, built up. And it took a long time for that water to cool down. So you're looking at maybe 2,000 years before the oceans cooled down to what they are today. Because water holds heat for a long time. So the whole world was well watered during the time of Moses even. 1,500 years or so after the flood, it was still more rain. Israel was still the land flowing. Now, if you have 70-degree water, that's going to keep the land near that water very warm as well. And so we know that water does moderate temperatures. It moderates the temperatures in Michigan. It moderates the temperatures in the British Isles by the Gulf Stream coming up that way. So if you have warm water along the coast, you're going to have ice-free areas. And we see that in Vancouver, north of Vancouver Island. There was a paper that came out a few years ago talking about human footprints during the Ice Age, the Pleistocene epoch. They found human footprints over here where the humans were walking barefoot in the mud. Right during the Ice Age, and here we are up, in Canada, north of here even, and they're walking barefoot because it was still pretty warm. So all in the water, if you stayed along the coast, things were pretty warm. So animals could migrate around if they stayed near the coast. And that's kind of what leads us to the biblical reason for the Ice Age. God did have a plan, just like he has a plan for each of us. I didn't know God's plan for me until I turned 52 years old and came to ICR. When I came to ICR, I realized that's God's plan for me to use all the experience I had in spite of my sinfulness. We all sin. God still can use us. He brought me to ICR. I had a PhD in hand, which I didn't plan ever getting, but I got laid off, so I had to go back and get a PhD. I never would have done all these things, but God had a plan. I just didn't know what it was. So some of you still may not know what God's got planned, but he has a plan. So I wish I would have known what I was at age 42, but at 52, so I'm doing all I can while God put me at ICR to do this work. I'm trying to do as much as I can that he put me there for. And I apologize to the boss. I'm using the old symbol here. He's going to be mad at me. I'll cover this up. Yeah, it's no DNA on there. Anyway, biblical reason, let's move on. I'm stalling around. But I do feel like there is a plan for each of us. God does say in Jeremiah 29:11, he's got plans for us. And he had a plan for the Ice Age. There was a reason for the Ice Age. Here's what it was. Let's go back to the biblical timeline again. I got ahead of myself earlier. What do we have here? Is the flood ends here based on the biblical genealogies. So that's, add 2,000 years to that or so. And here we are. Abram was born around maybe 1996 BC, 2000 BC. Job, most biblical scholars think Job lived about the same time, maybe, in the Middle East area. And so you're looking at the Ice Age maximum would have been 500 years after the floods. You had, 500 years, you're a little bit over here beyond the birth of Abram, who became Abraham. And so he was living at the same time the Ice Age was going on. The Ice Age might have lasted 700 years, Mike Ord has estimated, but it reached a maximum after about 500 years, maybe. Mike Ord's done some really good work on that as a former meteorologist for the government. So it's all kind of in that time, but you don't hear about it, you don't read about it in the Bible, but if you read the book of Job, as I mentioned, Job and Abram were probably living on the Middle East at about the same time, but in the book of Job, you can read through it, and Henry Morris went through back in the days before computers, and he counted up the number of references to snow and ice in the book of Job compared to any other book of the Bible, and he found there's more references to snow and ice and cold than any other book of the Bible. Because while he was alive, while Abram was alive too, the ice was building up in northern Europe, scouring away northern Europe, scouring away northern North America and Siberia, and building up all this snow and ice. But it is still where he lived, it was still cooler, and there was still a lot more rain going on for a couple thousand years after the flood, until the water cooled down. So here's kind of a key diagram here. This is the science here. Sea level dropped about almost 400 feet. And what happened was, here's the ice temperatures, and this is another estimate, I think, by Mike Ord, we put it at 30 degrees Celsius, maybe a little hotter. But of course, this is the cooling curve for the ocean over. This is kind of dropping down in temperature. These 500 years might have been the glacial maximum. But notice right here, as the ice builds up all that mile thick of ice across much of the northern hemisphere, you sucked up a lot of water. It's almost like a sponge. So the sea level was dropped and ended up dropping about 395 feet all over the world. What would the environmentalist people say today? What would they do? They'd panic. But this is a dramatic change in the climate. Sea level dropped 395 feet because it's sucked up by about the glacial maximum. Here's sea level right here. These are in meters. You can do the meters by multiplying by 3 and add a little bit. Again, I speak metric somewhat. Some of my sentences in metric aren't as good as others. But anyway, here you go. This is the sea level curve. Don't believe these years down here. That's the hogwash deep time years. Based on faulty carbon-14 dates at a certain point. They become faulty. But here's what really did happen. They can see the levels, and here we are today. See, look at sea levels rising. Well, it already did. Everybody's worried about sea level rising. You don't see these guys in their barefoot along Vancouver Island walking around with signs, scratching words on the cave wall saying climate change is causing us to lose our land. But it did. Here's what the world would look like if you dropped sea level 395 feet. I don't put ice, we don't believe there was ice on the coast, so cut this ice back a little bit because the water was still warm, like I mentioned earlier. But this is pretty much where the ice sheets were, and this was all dry land and brown. So you could land over here, wherever the mountains of Ararat exactly was, which mountain it was, and then you could walk anywhere. You could walk here, you could walk across here. You could walk to Ireland. You could walk across over here and go across the Bering Sea. It's all dry land. Come along the coast. If you stayed along the coast, there was no ice because the water was warm. Contrary to this diagram, this is a conventional geology diagram. They don't believe the water was warm, so they put ice everywhere. But you could walk right along the coast and get down to South America. What would be the purpose of that? Dropping sea level almost 400 feet all over the world. Well, if you land in this area, the ark lands in one spot. It wasn't a bus where it moved along a little bit and a few animals got out, went to the next continent, a few animals got out. How did they get the animals back? How did humans get back to these places? How did they become Native Americans or Native South Americans? They had to travel from the Middle East, where they landed over here in the Tower of Babel, wherever that was. Some people say it was further up here and down here, but nonetheless, it was in this region. And Henry Morris did a study one time, showed that this is the center of the land masses of the earth. God put them there for a reason. because it's the center of all the world's land masses after the flood. But he also had to have pathways to get you to these distant continents. He had to get big animals like mammoths and mastodons over here to North America during the Ice Age. He had to get horses and camels all around the world. All this could happen during the Ice Age when you have these land bridges that built up all over. But humans were disobeying. Nimrod and his cohorts were saying, let's stay here. Let's just stay here. Disobeying when God said, fill the earth. But the animals were filling the earth and humans were disobeying. So he had to go in there and he said, let us confound their languages so that humans would spread out. And the humans finally migrated out. The Neanderthal group went to northern Europe. Other groups went across Asia. Eventually, some of those groups got all the way across, maybe within a few hundred years. Perfect timing for when the ice was reaching its maximum. They could walk right across the Bering Sea. And those native tribes became the Native Americans. And they took the Stone Age technology that they had to use because they were on the run. Everybody's just like temporary housing, will stay in caves for a while, then we're going to keep going. And eventually they started building cities all over the world. It isn't like coincidence, all these places built the same types of structures. Many of them built step pyramids. Go to Chicxulub, or down to Chichen Itza. In Yucatan, you'll see step pyramids. You see step pyramids in India. You see step pyramids everywhere. Because they're probably remembering what the Tower of Babel was like as these groups went all around the world. And some of that's in my book and other books that ICR has put out over the years. So this disobedience actually really caused animals and humans to move, well, the humans particularly. But here's a map I'm going to show you that's a secular, conventional geology map. And I couldn't have drawn it any better. Look where everything comes from. Just don't believe the years. The years are off. But look where everything comes from. Could you draw this any better? Maybe move it up a few hundred miles. About there. Look at that. Come down here. You can walk around here. You can walk to here. You can walk to here. You can walk to here. You can walk along here. Anywhere you want to go, there was a little bit of a jump over here. A little bit of island hopping. Hence the kangaroos. But they do swim. Kangaroos do swim. So some strange animals ended up in Australia that went extinct as they left here and didn't survive. But in India, they find cave paintings of kangaroos because the kangaroos were here, and then they kept going. And so all these animals, but I think one of the reasons why you have kangaroos in Australia and nowhere else is they don't have any big predators other than crocodiles and snakes. There's no lions and tigers and bears. Those stayed in Asia. They didn't get down to South America. And so some of these koala bears and things are able to survive by living in the trees. They didn't survive anywhere else. So I kind of think of it as God's little zoo he set aside for us. Australia's our little zoo to preserve a lot of marsupials. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. But nonetheless, look at this map. I mean, you could have drawn it any better. So sea level's down almost 400 feet. You could walk anywhere for maybe 500 years. But then the water came back up, as you saw. Once the sea cooled to where it is today or close to today, you stopped producing so much rain. The snow stopped coming down in the north. The volcanoes stopped erupting so much, so the aerosols settle out, so the climate gets warmer, and you don't build up the ice. But we still have Antarctica and Greenland to remind us of the ice age, how much ice there is. But the environmentalists today are all worried about those melting away. But they'll just reveal more coal deposits and more oil deposits for us to use for energy and to farm. Now, you still won't get a lot of light down there. But it's the Bering Sea. You can walk right across to North America. And here's the dry land during the Ice Age across Europe. Here's mainland Europe. This was all dry land. And a lot of the North Sea was called Dogger Land, and they actually found evidence in this area of some, does that show up at all? For some reason, the outline of the UK isn't there, but out here in the North Sea, they actually found evidence of human civilizations. But what did the humans do? They were living out here. What did they do? They just moved. Sea level's coming up, people move. Unless you live in New Orleans. Sea level's coming up. You build a wall. You can build a wall, I guess, but basically, and the timing is perfect. God's timing is spot on. If this would have been like this during World War II, what would have happened? Hitler would have taken over everything. But he knew that he had to carve a channel in here During the Ice Age, as the water melted off and the ice melted off, carved a big channel, which centuries and centuries later, he used it for his purposes to preserve the British people and some of the French armies as they escaped from Dunkirk. The tanks couldn't roll across the water. But you could walk across there during the Ice Age for several hundred years, and that's how the animals and probably a lot of the humans got to Ireland and Scotland. Became my ancestors. Oh, I guess you can see it on here. Does it show up on there at all? I guess it's not projecting. All right, well, moving right along. Let's summarize. Scientific evidence tells us by the scratches and striations and moraines and erratics all over the northern hemisphere. And again, scientists didn't even believe there was an ice age until about the later 19th century. Until somebody started putting two and two together going, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And they realized there is a lot of evidence for one ice age at least. And I think there only is evidence for one big ice age after the flood, caused by the flood. It was caused by the flood because of the hot water that was produced because of the new seafloor that was created during the flood year, all out of lava. So all that temperature went into the water, producing lots of evaporation. And then you also had the subduction causing these volcanoes to create aerosols. And so the northern latitudes and the southernmost latitudes got very, very cold compared to the rest of the world, but the whole world was cool. It was rainier and wet, cooler. There were no Texans. I don't know, they would have gone because they would have stayed right in the equator, I guess, to stay warm. They don't like cold. And also, the Ice Age was necessary. There was a reason for the Ice Age. It was to allow dispersal. So if you land in one spot in the world, how are you going to get everywhere unless you take a boat? But the animals aren't taking boats. Mammoths aren't taking boats. They had to walk across from dry land. So they could walk over several centuries. They could walk across one to the other. But there are mammoth sites down in Waco, right, Joel? So there's mastodons were living in Florida. Mammoths were living in Florida during the Ice Age. It wasn't a much cooler climate even across all of North America. But it would have been even colder here in North Dakota than it is now, by far. And so people were living further south. But it was well watered. And the ice came right up to just north of Medora, about 70 miles north of Medora. So you could have been hunting mastodons and mammoths here. Do they have mastodons and mammoths in this area, though? Never found any? They don't think even of glacial sediment here, that's why. Anyway, it says in Isaiah 55:9, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So it's a pleasure to work at ICR and get this much of God's wisdom. When he gives us a little bit of wisdom, it's so little compared to him. To understand, to get an understanding of why there was an ice age, why there was a flood, was a judgment. But God also brought a way to repopulate the earth. Because of the conditions of the flood setting up the ice age, it was just a wonderful plan. It's almost like dominoes. Once he started it, cracked open all those cracks all over the earth, he just kind of went one right after the other. But it was all his plan, all by design. And the timing of it was perfect as well. We just are seeing this much understanding of it. There's a whole lot more we'll learn about when we get to heaven. Neither is there salvation in any other, it says in Acts 4, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. And that name is Jesus Christ. God, who was there at the creation, he was there at the judgment of the flood, he was there to restore the earth. Part of that was done with the Ice Age to allow the populations of animals and humans to walk from place to place. And he's there. He was the one who died on the cross for our sins, for my sins and your sins. And we just have to believe. He commendeth his love toward us, and while we were yet sinners. We're all sinners, but we're saved by the grace of Christ. He died for us, much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. So we truly are saved if we believe in Jesus. He's the only one. There's no other name you can be saved, but he had a plan all along to bring you here to this moment and do what you're doing. Do what I'm doing. Do what we're doing at ICR. And we can't do it without you guys, your prayers and your financial support. So thank you. That's in carved in stone. I have a whole chapter on the Ice Age that you can rip it out if you want. It's sort of a standalone chapter. But it ties in at the end of the flood. You can read about and Jake Hebert. Actually, Joel wants you to get rid of those, don't you, Joel? We got a bunch of these carved in stone books back there. But there's a whole chapter in the Ice Age. There's even a chapter talking about the step pyramids towards the end, how you step pyramids all over the world. There's all these common things that we see, because as people dispersed from the Babel, they took those same technology, they took the same ideas from place to place. And my colleague, we don't have any of these with us, but you can go to our website, icr.org, and you can order the book on the Ice Age by Jake Hebert, and he explains even in more detail, what you heard here in greater detail, explanation of why Milankovitch theory doesn't work, and why only the flood explains the Ice Age that came on after the flood. So a necessary ending to the flood was the Ice Age. And there's a couple of chapters in this Creation Basics and Beyond book on the Ice Age as well. And these are all short chapters. So if you haven't picked up that book yet, there's still a few of those left. And there's a lot of my carved in stone books there that many of you already have, I suppose. Who already has carved in stone? What about the rest of you? Okay, well, you can pay shipping if you want to order it from our website, or you can get it without shipping here. And of course, we always have this, free Acts and Facts. And so that's our gift to you for enduring these talks, suffering through them in the cold Ice Age temperatures. We requested it to get really, really cold in here for this Ice Age talk, so you would feel the cooler weather. If you go to our museum, the Discovery Center down in Dallas, you go in the Ice Age room. It's painted so it looks like that blue over here. It looks kind of like this, but it's about 5 degrees colder in there than everywhere else. So during the summertime, most of us huddle in there. If Dr. G's looking for us, that's where we are. Now, usually our rooms are cold enough. It's like here. Anyway, thank you very much. I'll let you guys go on that one. So.